Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the problems with the 2006 format. Now, this video might be a little bit surprising to some people because, generally speaking, the 2006 format is considered to be the pinnacle of the Pokemon trading card game. You had a lot of viable decks that could easily win a tournament on different days, on any given day, and you had a lot of very fun matchups. You had a lot of very strategic gameplay. But at the same time, the format isn't without its problems. Starting off here, this was a format where power creep really started to show. 2004, 2005, and then it really ramped up in 2006 with decks like LBS, for example. And we'll jump right to it, where thanks to cards like Blastoise EX and the consistency of Pidgeot, it was absolutely nothing to throw 200 damage at your opponent every single turn with relative ease. And if your opponent knocked out a Lugia, it was no big deal because you just retrieve her right back. You could hit anything in play for 100 damage with cards like Steelix, and if your opponent tried to get clever and throw a large EX at you, you could just use Latias to knock out in one hit. I played a game a couple of days ago with LBS against a player that was playing Jimmy's Evolutions deck. Got a crazy opening hand. Turn 1 Pidgeot led to a turn 1 Blastoise, which led to a turn 2 Lugia. And from there, I ended up winning the game in about 4 turns. Opponent didn't do anything wrong, but it was just one of those games where I got an insane start and just steamrolled my opponent. And in 2006, I feel like this happens more often than you see in other formats. And there's a little bit less back and forth than I feel like I'm going to say there can be less back and forth than what you see in other formats if your opponent just gets that crazy start. Now, going along with that, the format is incredibly heavily dependent on matchups, and there's a lot of really fun matchups, a lot of really close matchups, and a lot of good matchups to play. But at the same time too, there's also a lot of matchups that feel near impossible to win. LBS versus Mutrick, for example, it's very, very hard for an LBS player to come through and beat Mutrick. Sure, it's winnable, but it can be incredibly, incredibly tough to do so. And it's just not necessarily, it just doesn't feel like a fun game to play or to feel like you have a whole lot of interactions in it, which brings me to another complaint that's pretty common with the 2006 format is there's a lot of hard no's in the format. And in like 2005, for example, your opponent would play a Battle Frontier to shut off your Pidgeot. And then you would have to play a counter stadium to bump that Battle Frontier. In 2006, there's a lot more hard no cards with things like, Pidgeot Delta, for example. If you have a hole in energy on it, your opponent can't use any powers. That's a hard no. You can just set it on the bench. It doesn't have to be active. You don't really need to do a whole lot to protect it. Just set it on the bench, and you probably win the game if your opponent is reliant on powers. Now, Lunatone Solrock is another one here, where if you have Lunatone and Solrock in play, your opponent is just not going to be able to use Pidgeot and Recargo. You don't really need to have them active. You don't need to do anything special. Just set them on the bench. Houndoom's another one. No item cards. Just set it on the bench. And I think, and I'm oversimplifying it because there are some counters. Some of these cards, obviously things like Pidgeot Delta, you can play Latias for POW hand extension to bring up like a Lunatone or Solrock and knock it out. But it's still the fact that you have these incredibly powerful bench sitters that can just sit back there and just tell your opponent hard no's on major parts of the game. It can be very frustrating to play against. Another common complaint is that there's a lot of things in the format that things will happen and you don't feel like you can impact them. And like we talked about with like Lunatone and Solrock, for example, Mutrick is another one where your opponent can just sit there. It's incredibly easy to set up a disconnect, even as soon as the second turn of the game, where literally all your opponent is going to be doing is it takes literally a stage 1 and 2 energy to go, your opponent cannot play item cards. And you can combine that with your own really, really powerful item cards like ER2, POW hand extension, Cursed Stone, Battle Frontier, whatever it is, and you can just sit there and go disconnect, and there's really not a whole lot your opponent is going to be able to do to get out of that. And that can be very, very frustrating to play against. Now, another example of this is going to be Bombtar. And I think Bombtar is probably, in my opinion, the absolute worst offender of any of the decks we're going to talk about today, because essentially there's nothing you're really doing to impact it. You just sit there and you go, your opponent just kind of hopes you don't set up. I was playing a game last night against Chuck where he was playing Nidoqueen, I was playing Bombtar. I think it was my third turn of the game. He's had, I think, 2 turns. All he's got in play is I got a Lunatone Solrock in play, so he's never going to be able to quick search. He's got a Nidorina with a double rainbow on the bench, so he's got some threats there, but I basically just blow up an Electrode EX, throw all my energy under a Dark Tranitar, POW his Nidorina, and admin him to a 4-card hand. Knock out his Nidorina. He's only had 2 turns. He's got absolutely nothing in play. He's got a 4-card hand. He can't use quick search. He's trying to fight back. Chuck didn't do anything wrong. It was just the fact that all that stuff just happened to him. And the fact that you can intentionally put yourself down on prizes at any point in the game you want to, so you can activate incredibly powerful cards like POW, is very, very, very frustrating to play against. And there's a lot of times, even when you're playing against Powtar, for example, where you blow an Electrode, they go down to 4. They knock out the Dark Tranitar, they go down to 3. You blow the second Electrode to put them at 1 prize, put it all on that last Dark Tranitar, and then you admin them to a 1-card hand. And essentially they have no setup and a 1-card hand to try to deal with a Dark Tranitar hitting for like 100 plus damage a turn. And there's nothing they can do to counter it, because if they try to set up any sort of threat, you're just going to POW it up and knock it out. Things like that and strategies like that are very frustrating to play against. And I think the absolute last one, and I think Powtar and Mullock are probably the 2 worst offenders of this in the format, but it's just these POW control style decks where essentially Mullock, for example, is going to intentionally try to go down on prizes, and once they do, they're just going to POW something active and repeatedly sniff out the POW. And it's another game where you feel like you have very little interaction and very little ability to affect the overall outcome of the game. And in those sort of situations, it's incredibly, incredibly, incredibly frustrating to play against. And you literally don't feel like you get to do anything, and everything just kind of happens to you. Like you have no control over it. And not only is that creating a lock, and locks in general are very frustrating, but to feel like you can't actually do anything to play into, you're not even playing into it, it's happening to you, and there's really no way to play out of it. And just all of those things combined can be very frustrating. So I honestly do think the 2006 format is probably one of the best formats in the game, right up there with 2010 in my opinion. But it's also can be a very, very frustrating format to play in. And it also has to be a format that you really, really, I do feel like it really rewards good deck building and good strategy and good understanding of the game. But at the same time, too, there's also going to be games where it doesn't matter how good you are, how much you understand, that your opponent just gets some crazy hands with LBS or Bombtar, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. And that can be very frustrating. So it's either going to, some games will be the most skill-intensive back-and-forth games you're ever going to see, and other games are going to be just complete blowouts, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. And I think that comes with some of the frustrations of 2006, where I don't feel like there's really, there is some healthy middle ground there, but you also have those 2 extremes, and sometimes those 2 extremes are far worse than you see in other formats. So that, in my opinion, is the problems of the 2006 format, and I hope to see you in the next video.